show our jointness and our willingness to bring highlight and spotlight to our friends from Colorado Springs in this case. Colonel Jim Cook, who's the chair of the Department of Philosophy at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, a career Air Force officer, now a permanent military professor. He will facilitate this panel that will look at these three different types of warfare ethics from places other than the United States. Jim, thank you.
Thanks, Art. And thanks for putting a blockbuster panel at the end of the day. I don't think this is going to be anything but a pleasure, and I'm sorry that some of us did have to miss it. Because of the theme of the conference, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address in some fashion an issue that I think enjoys consensus, and that is that we have to know more about other countries and other cultures' opinions about just war. That's true regardless of the phase of war we're talking about, whether we're talking about planning and education, antebellum, whether we're talking about considerations ad bellum, whether we're in bello execution phase or post bellum. Surely we'll do better in whatever any of those activities if we know more about the ethics of war perceived through the cultures that are involved along with ours. Some of them will be enemies, some of them will be allies. And this will help us, presumably, sharpen our own thinking as well. So today we have this marvelous panel that can't offer a comprehensive portrait of all just war thinking, obviously, but we do have a nice subset. We'll begin with Professor John Kelsay, who's Bristol Professor in Religion at Florida State University. He also serves there as Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Kelsay received his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Virginia in 1985, and since that time, the focus of his research and teaching has been Christian and Muslim political thought, especially with respect to judgments about war. His most recent book is Arguing the Just War in Islam, that was published by Harvard in 2007. And I'll just note personally that along with James Turner Johnson, Professor Kelsay has done wonders for my own classes. We often, for example, read a piece that came out in an edited volume of 2003 on the epistle and declaration of Al-Qaeda members in 96 and 98. So I certainly owe him a personal debt of gratitude. And please, okay, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks very much. Everybody can hear me? Okay. So I understand our charge in talking about these various traditions to give some sense of past, present, and future. And accordingly, this talk about Islam has three parts. First one you can think of as a historical development. Second one, the debate over Al-Qaeda and like-minded groups. And the third one, with respect to the future, you can call, we've seen this movie before. So, in the history of Islamic tradition, there are three primary forms of writing that have had influence with respect to conceptions of war. There's the writing of philosophers like Al-Farabi, who talks about war in connection with the virtuous or ideal city. There are the Mirrors of Princes, in which court advisors like the famous Nizam al-Mulk set down their experiential wisdom in the hopes of educating wise statesmen. And then there are the rulings of the learned, usually called jurists, who issue opinions on a variety of questions and provide guidance, access to divine guidance according to the theory, for believers who make inquiries. All of these have been important at various times in the history of Islam, but I think it is fair to say that the one that is most consistently important, and certainly the one that is the most revealing for us today, is the discourse of the jurists, and that's what I'm going to talk about. When jurists talked about war, they did so typically under the rubric of a collected set of judgments called Ahkam al-Jihad, the judgments pertaining to armed struggle. This discourse developed, as did the rest of the juridical discourse, as the province of a particular class of people who were called ulama, literally those in the know or the learned. Their associations and traditions eventually coalesced with the standard schools that are present even to this day in Sunni and Shi'i Islam. Now, there are interesting distinctions in the question of sources used, particularly between the Sunni and the Shia. There are even more interesting, perhaps, distinctions in the preferred methods of interpretation between the schools. But for our purposes, what is interesting as a point of departure is a standard format. An inquirer comes to a scholar and poses a question. What's the right thing to do in circumstance X? And the scholar issues a fatwa, an opinion, in which the goal is to establish a fit between the textual precedents given in the Quran, in sound reports about the Prophet's words and deeds, and in established precedents from prior generations of scholars. The scholar wants to establish a fit between those precedents and current circumstance in order to ascertain divine guidance. This is the process that most people describe as Islamic law or jurisprudence. For various reasons, I prefer a term, Sharia reasoning. It's the Sharia that they are aiming at, which is the path that leads to refreshment. It is the path for which, according to most of the texts, God has promised never to leave human beings without guidance so that they might follow it. Now, the ulama exercised this process of Sharia reasoning and issued opinions on a wide range of questions. Some of these had to do with the use of military force. While the format of question and response over repeated generations doesn't lend itself easily to a systematic presentation, it's nevertheless possible, I think, to ascertain and describe a general consensus about legitimate war along the following lines. Legitimate war is, first, authorized by recognized public authorities, usually meaning the head of state, for Sunni Muslims, for example, in the classical period, the caliph, or by his designated representative. Legitimate war is, second, associated with the cause of establishing, maintaining, or defending a geopolitical entity in which Islam is dominant. And then third, legitimate war is conducted in ways consistent with right intention. These ways include issuing a formal declaration to the enemy with alternatives offered, avoidance of direct killing of children, women, and others presumed to be non-combatants, and then limiting the use of weapons and tactics in ways that are proportionate to a particular military objective. These criteria constitute a broad outline of Ahkam al-Jihad. The ulama knew of exceptional cases. Let me just mention one, since it has import for talking about Al-Qaeda. In cases where a foreign power invades Muslim territory and the most obvious political authorities are unable or unwilling to respond, the ulama employed a kind of emergency argument. In this case, they said, ordinary procedures of command and control are suspended. Fighting becomes an individual responsibility. Now, the terminology can be misleading. What the ulama meant historically was understood more along the following lines. Suppose that the provincial authorities in Damascus failed to mount a defense against intruders. In such a case, authorities more removed, say in Egypt or Iraq, should send help. The reasoning is thus not so radical as the terminology individual duty might suggest. That's an important piece of the puzzle associated with contemporary militancy, and so we're moving to the debate over Al-Qaeda. As is well known, the February 1998 declaration signed by bin Laden, Zawahiri, and others refers to a unanimous opinion of ulama to the effect that when an enemy is occupying Muslim lands, fighting becomes an individual duty. On this basis, those who sign give the opinion that fighting against Americans and their allies, civilians and soldiers, is the duty of any Muslim able to carry it out in any context where it's possible. So here, individual is taken quite literally, not so much as the historical ulama meant it. That text was associated with the World Islamic Front, which represented a union of Al-Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, and other groups. The authors were not the first to reason in this way. The Charter of Hamas used the language of individual duty along these same lines, as did the Testament of the Assassins of Sadat. Broadly speaking, in fact, this language and this take on individual duty is reflected in the rhetoric of Muslim resistance groups since the 19th century. Nevertheless, the argument outlined in 1998 has been the object of considerable Muslim criticism, especially since 2001. The arguments of the critics and the counter-arguments by bin Laden and others are very important for us to consider. Critics can be lined up in two broad groups. One I call Muslim advocates of democracy. The other are Muslim advocates of divine governance, that is, they share something of the goals of Al-Qaeda, or alternatively, you could call them Muslims interested in the conduct of honorable jihad. The first group, Muslim advocates of democracy, aims at the issue of just cause in the sense of challenging the overarching goals of Al-Qaeda and related groups. The usual form of this criticism notes that bin Laden and others identify an Islamic state with governance by divine law in the strict sense, that is, all laws and policies would be susceptible of a test. How straightforwardly can they be derived from the standard sources of Quran, the example of the Prophet, and precedents set by established scholars? According to the Muslim Democrats, it's important that Al-Qaeda sets this as the norm, along with the fact that Al-Qaeda spokespersons eschew constitutional democracy. Muslim advocates of democracy regard this as inconsistent with a contemporary application of Sharia reasoning. They argue that a properly Islamic state, based on a reading of precedent and a fit with the current circumstance, should be a state consistent with notions of human rights. And this requires constitutional democracies in which Muslim and non-Muslim citizens, men and women alike, are treated equally. The critics then add that the failure of Al-Qaeda and like-minded groups to distinguish between civilians and soldiers is a strong violation of historic precedent, and they ask their co-religionists, do you really want groups that fail in war conduct to actually hold political power? The second line of criticism focuses on war conduct and brings in right authority in a particular way. So, those who are advocating fighting honorable jihad say that the failure to distinguish between civilian and military targets violates precedent going all the way back to the Prophet. Further, the understanding of fighting as individual duty articulated in the 1998 fatwa and other texts, these critics say is incorrect. If Muslims in Afghanistan are threatened, then established authorities in, say, Saudi Arabia should rally support. Further, these critics argue that issuing fatwa, opinions, is the job of established ulama, not of lay Muslims like bin Laden and al-Zawahiri. For these critics, the goal of a state ruled by divine law seems right. But their point is, bin Laden and others are going the wrong way to get there. Now, the responses by bin Laden and others are very interesting. I'll just note them briefly. For bin Laden and others, the first group of critics, the Muslim advocates of democracy, is in the grip of America. These people, so Al-Qaeda spokespersons say, are advocating a corrupt form of governance that promises disorder in this world and damnation in the next. As to the second group, the response is to acknowledge the strength of precedents requiring distinctions between civilian and military targets, and then to argue that this requirement is not absolute. Of the several lines of argument proffered, the most forceful is framed in terms of reciprocal justice. As bin Laden famously put it, they kill our civilians, so we kill theirs. Quran 2, verses 190 through 194, and in particular the phrase, "fight them as they are fighting you," is sometimes cited. The exegesis of the passage is interesting, and I'll be happy to talk about it in the question period if you like. Further, since America is a democracy, bin Laden argues all its people share the blame for America's failings with respect to the Muslim world. And as to the individual duty point, the response of bin Laden and others is, when those responsible, say the Saudi rulers, fail in their duty, it's up to a vanguard to defend the rights of Muslims. Then too, as bin Laden notes on more than one occasion, his declarations are crafted in consultation with ulama. It's just that he has the ability to distinguish between the good ones and the bad ones. The bad ones being those too cowardly or corrupt to call for jihad. Now, where are we going? In particular, what is the import of the wave of protest that began in Tunisia and is making its way across the historically Muslim area for Muslim discourse on war and for American and allied policy? Let me frame things this way. When protests began in Tunisia, some observers noted the distinct lack of militant rhetoric among the protesters. Comment about this increased when the Egyptian demonstrations began. The face of the protest, people said, seems different. These were young, affluent people wired into social networks like Facebook. Their interest in freedom seemed to move toward constitutional democracy, so people wondered, is this a sign that Al-Qaeda's influence is diminishing? My answer is probably not. I think this for a couple of reasons. The first can be summarized in terms of the success of the autocrats. Hosni Mubarak was not a particularly good administrator, but he did succeed in radically delimiting the ability of opponents to organize. Thus, when the protests succeeded, they did so in part because of the help of the Muslim Brothers, one of the few viable political organizations to survive during the Mubarak years. Even more, the protests succeeded because the army at some point said no to killing large numbers of protesters. It's an interesting question why that stance was taken. My own view, perhaps overly cynical, is that some high-ranking officers decided that it was time for Mubarak to go, not least on the grounds that it was their turn to take the reins. This means the revolution was highly likely to be co-opted. The lack of organization among the Facebook crowd made them unable to compete with the combination of the Muslim Brothers and the military elite. This showed up in the recent constitutional referendum. In short, the prospects for democratic change are slim. The success of autocrats in cutting off channels of dissent is even more pronounced in Libya, Yemen, and if it comes to it, Syria. In these states, the deposition of rulers is likely to leave a great void, and it's likely that the resulting chaos will be sufficient to require stabilization by an international presence. The combination of civil strife and foreign influence will be ideal for Al-Qaeda's decentralized, entrepreneurial, opportunistic approach. In short, I'm saying that the arguments occasioned by the claims of Al-Qaeda are going to be with us for the foreseeable future because Al-Qaeda is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. American and allied policymakers will be faced with the task of crafting an approach that can address this challenge, even as we have been so faced for the last 10 years. So far, the two proposals we have focus on counterinsurgency, as articulated by Generals Petraeus, McChrystal, and others, and the kind of counterterrorism that was used as a catchphrase for the position associated with Vice President Biden in 2009, when there was the debate over ratcheting up the number of forces in Afghanistan, that is, use of more targeted killings, drones, and so on. Neither one quite fits with the nature of Al-Qaeda, which is probably why we are doing both, trying to clear, hold, and build territory on the one hand, and employing drones in a program of targeted killings on the other. Of the two, counterinsurgency is the best designed to exploit the weakest point in Al-Qaeda's case for legitimacy, that is, its penchant for killing civilians. But coin is also extremely demanding, and so long as the enemy can find safe haven by crossing borders, it's difficult to find success. The kind of counterterrorism associated with the vice president, at least back a couple of years ago, by contrast, seems less labor-intensive, though it allows the enemy to present pictures intended to highlight bin Laden's justification. They kill our civilians, we kill theirs. The intra-Muslim debate is thus going to continue, with the strongest criticisms of Al-Qaeda focusing on its tactics. At the same time, the odd nature of this group will make it difficult for anyone to mount a successful campaign against it. Al-Qaeda is neither a traditional counterinsurgency nor a traditional terror group. It combines elements of both, not least because it regards the world as a single battlefield. In terms of the title of a text by Asuri, who was an Al-Qaeda strategist taken captive in Pakistan in 2005, it is a call for global Islamic resistance. It seems nearly impossible to fight the group without doing things that lend support ultimately to its narrative of an international order designed to suppress Islam. And so I think when we look into our crystal ball and ask where this tradition is going, we're likely to think that we've seen this movie already. Thanks.
Well, again, if you would, please hold your questions till all of the speakers have had their chance. Our next is P.C. Lo from Hong Kong Baptist University. I had the pleasure of meeting him just last night. He is Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts, the Director of the Center for Applied Ethics, and Professor of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. He holds a PhD in Moral Philosophy, which he earned at SUNY Buffalo in 1982, and he holds a PhD in Religious Ethics that he earned at Yale in 1990. His publications are mostly in bioethics, religion and morality, and Confucian ethics. His article, The Art of War Corpus and Chinese Just War Ethics, Past and Present, is forthcoming in the Journal of Religious Ethics. Professor?
Thanks. Now, this panel was asked by Ed Barrett to address one common question, namely, how did the warfare ethics position develop, and what future directions could the tradition support? So to follow this instruction, my presentation is divided into this historical part from 1 to 5, and then number 6 is the present situation, and then this is the future development. I have more than 70 slides, so I'm going to speed you through my presentation. Talk about Chinese traditions. There are many traditions, as you have known. I myself is focusing on this last one, the military strategy school. According to many researchers right now, except the Taoist school, the other schools, they all have some conception of the, so to speak, just war or righteous war. It's difficult to translate. Some people say just war is a better translation or righteous war is a better translation. There's still some debate, but the terminology is there 2,000 years ago. And then eventually, the other language, just warrior or righteous warrior, is becoming more popular. But in spite of so, I mean, that idea, that language is there in the Chinese tradition. Okay, then I want to talk, why do I want to pick on that particular school? Because there's a continuity between that school and the PLA today, which they self-consciously are trying to inherit such a rich heritage of the military strategy school. So it is only natural that they would endorse a certain version of their warfare ethics. In this school, there's a large corpus of works, and the most important of them are being collected as being known as the 7 military classics. Actually, these have been, this is published in 1993. So it has been in English for a while. And I'm kind of surprised that there's not much work being done on this body of work yet. The translator, Rolf Sawyer, was a businessman in Hong Kong. It is in Hong Kong that he get in touch with all these books and how the people apply them in the business world and so on and so forth. And then he made a career translating all these works into English. And these seven treatises are these ones. Keep pressing the wrong button. Are these. And then the first 5, as you can see, they're composed roughly 2,000 years ago. So the ideas I'm going to present to you are the ideas that were there in the text more than 2,000 years ago. And it's not only there, it is also eventually being developed in the tradition. And therefore, rightly, we can say it is a tradition of just war thinking. Why is that a tradition? A tradition because eventually they're being collected together, and then they're considered, the required reading for any military generals, and also for exams. These are the required texts, and therefore they acquire that kind of canonical status. And there's a lot of commentary on them and so on and so forth, and they're still being studied today. So it is fair to say this is a tradition of thought rather than just pieces of writings. And in addition to being translated in English, this is a monograph. This is a monograph published in 1995, which is based on this PhD dissertation in 1993. And this entire monograph was a study of these 7 military classics. So it has been studied in English, all right? And this is in 1995. And again, I'm surprised. Between 1995 and now, I'm not seeing much other secondary materials on these 7 books. Now, I wanted, and in this part, I'm trying to look at the perspectives of war in these treatises. One thing that stands out is, these 7 treatises, they're basically manuals of wars. They teach you how to fight and how to win. But in the meantime, there are also some advices about statecraft. And then from time to time, when they talk about war, then certain expressions keep popping up, saying that the military or the weapons are brutal implements. Occurs quite often in different treatises. Or another way of putting it is they are ominous instruments. So while they are advising people how to fight and how to win, they at the same time acknowledging there's something not right about what we are doing. And then also that another point is they're not just producing manuals of how to win at all costs. They're at the same time acknowledging that you need to distinguish between a right war and a wrong war. And then in their terminology, which is largely in the Confucian idioms of virtue ethics, it just has to do with benevolence and righteousness. Say in this case, engage in battle with righteousness. When you fight, the action should incorporate righteousness. So these occur rather often. So for them, the view of war is they look at war as necessary evil. It is bad, tragic, but it should be reluctantly resorted to only as a last resort. Now, I think this is something I would appreciate what they are saying because they are the moralists within the military profession. For someone like myself, I would consider myself a moralist on the sideline. It's just easy for me to say, the weapons and military are brutal implements. They're inauspicious instruments. But for them, within the profession, they acknowledge their profession, there is some kind of moral problematic in there. It is very, I think it's not easy to say this, and they are bold enough to say this. Okay, now let's go into the traditional just war discussion, the use ad bellum and use in bello. You will see Jim Johnson's name keep coming up because in my early essay, I have an extended conversation with him, and I learned from him a lot, and we email, and then we talk, and then that's why it comes up in some of the PowerPoints. Now, first of all, use ad bellum. I mean, this is one clear instance of use ad bellum. It is from this particular treatise, and then it says that, let's ignore these parts, and then just go down here. And it says that for this reason, if one must kill a man to give stability and order to the people, then killing is permissible. If one must attack a state out of love for the people, then attacking is permissible. If one must stop war with war, although it is war, it is permissible. So clearly they're talking about just causes here. And they ignore this one. And then there's another one, another treatise. They're trying to separate, there are 5 kinds of army. And then in here, one of them is called the righteous army, and then the other is called by some other names, which are, unethical. But then for the righteous army, what do they do? They suppress the violently perverse and rescue the people from chaos. And this is called righteousness. So again, this is some kind of, just war thinking. And use ad bellum, just cause. So these are the commonly just causes talked about in these 7 treatises. And then in Jim Johnson's work, he distinguished the just resort to war and the wise resort to war, saying that in the classic tradition, only the just resort to war is there. The wise resort came later. But in Chinese tradition that I just studied, it seems to me that some of these wise resort to war, they were present at the same time as this just resort to war. So there's no such distinction between the wise and the just in the Chinese view that I'm studying. And then, all right, now then let's go to use in bellum. There are 3 important passages. One is here. In this particular passage, it says that when you go to war, then wherever you go, do not cut down the trees, do not do this, do not do this, do not do this. Why? Because in so doing, then you will show the populace that you do not harbor vicious intentions. Now, this is what I try to interpret is what Professor Walser said yesterday. You need to win the hearts and minds of the populace. And that's why, you don't want to hurt the civilians, the non-combatants. And then in another passage, it's again saying this, do not do this, do not do that. And then covering a large number of different kinds of civilians. And then there's also a 3rd passage that I don't have time to quote. But there are 3 extended passages in these 7 treatises that can belong to the use in bello discussions. And these passages are acknowledged, say in this book, produced in Taiwan, 1 civilian, 1 military man, and they consider these passages are equivalent to the use in bello. So I'm not the first one to talk about it. I'm not the weird one to put forward such a thesis. It is now gaining some kind of acceptance, even say among the military in Taiwan. However, as I said, there's a monograph that studied these 7 treatises. It's still the only monograph. He's teaching at Harvard. But then he has some very weird conclusion. He said after studying these treatises, and then he said when they talk about righteous war, and they said for them, the righteous war is the ends clearly justify the means. And then for them, and he said that there's no a priori moral limits on the means and the methods of righteous war. I find it very astonishing. It's clearly there. And then for the 3 passages that I just quoted, but then Johnston was said, those are actually passages that apply to a post-bellum situation, which I've totally perplexed. Then the principle, how much time do I have? Oh, no. Oh, no, it's still 9 minutes, right? Okay. I'll talk about a little bit about proportionality. Understandably, the principle of proportionality is not there. Even in the Western tradition, it came very late. So you wouldn't expect the Chinese to have this articulated at that time, especially when the weapons are very primitive. But there's still, the spirit is there, namely the spirit about the concern about the casualties. The concern of trying to win the war with as least destruction as possible. So in that kind of moral sensitivity, I submit, is there. For example, in this book, which is extensively studied in this country, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, or by Sun Tzu, that's pronounced in this country. In this very famous passage in chapter 3, he's talked about that the best way to engage in war is to, you need to preserve rather than to destroy. And that's one very famous saying, saying that subjugating the enemy's army without fighting, that would be the art of war par excellence. And then I skip this and then continue on. He would say that how to do that, and then you need to attack their plans and then attack the alliance. If all this would not work, then attack the army. Only if still would not work, then you are trying to attack the fortified cities, which will be very brutal. So for him, the priority is try to win the war with the least casualty possible. And then to finish the quotation again, he's saying that we must try to, the paramount aim is to fight with, to fight at the same time to win and to also to preserve. So there's a very heightened concern for casualties here. And then this is not just me saying this. This is a very classic translation. Right now there's something like 20 English translation of this treatise. That perplexed me. There's only some 7,000 words in Chinese, but there are so many English translations. And this is, from a very reliable source and someone who has the military sensitivity. And then in his introduction, he said that for him, for Sun Tzu, in order to attain victory, you need to do A, B, and C. Namely, you have to inflict on the enemy the fewest possible casualties. That's by, this is interpretation by Griffith. So again, that there's a sense that there is a concern for casualty. And then you all know about this gentleman, and actually I know about him from Jim Johnson. Again, very indebted to Jim Johnson. But he wrote a foreword to that English translation. And he said in this passage, your eyes can read faster than my tongue to read it, so why don't you just read it? And then he continues on. He said that in reading Sun Tzu, he said there are many things that I find him that have similar thought with myself, especially on the what is called the indirect approach. And for him, the indirect approach is good. Why did he say the reason that he advocated the indirect approach for two reasons. Number one, he thinks there is a higher chance of success. And number two, because it would produce less casualties. And then Eric Liddell says, I find the same thing in Sun Tzu. So again, the concern for casualty is there. Now, come to the PLA. There are two books. You see the authors are in uniform, the PLA authors. And then for them, I can find that they read more or less the same thing. In the interpretation of Sun Tzu, they said that in these passages, what Sun Tzu is trying to say is to make the enemy submit in the maximum degree with casualties to both sides reduced to the minimum. And then my view is that kind of moral sensitivity is there, but it's present only partially and only as an ideal. But I don't see any reason why not it should not be turned into a requirement in the future development. All right. Now, in short, let me skip this. Now, then let's come to the present. Now, in this, as I said before, these 7 treatises in the past had the status of a canon. But now it's no longer so because things have changed. The government has changed. It's no longer monarchy and so on and so forth. And so in such a post-canon age, one is free to pick and choose and selected parts of the canonical materials. And so these authority, they now have diminished. And also they have been fragmented because In the past, when they are part of the canon, you can harmonize them. But right now, and they all can stand alone, and then there's diversity and tension with them as well. So instead of talking about one common tradition, you can now talk about different traditions. And then, now what I'm trying to say later on here in this part is, the PLA has been very ambivalent on this idea of just war, and I try to explain why so. First of all, from the time of Mao Zedong, they say very clearly, I mean, they like the idea of just war, and then read this statement by Mao Zedong. History knows only two kinds of wars, just and unjust. I mean, he keeps saying it. This is 1935, 1936, 1938. I mean, he liked the idea of just war. And then this heritage lasts, I mean, even now, and in an encyclopedia volume of military science, 2007, there's an entry called Just and Unjust War. I mean, it's put in Chinese and then parentheses English, and English is Just and Unjust War. So for them, the idiom is there. The PLA is fond of talking about just war. But for them, I mean, what are the examples of just war? I mean, they give these kind of examples, very, I mean, Marxist tainted. And then there are, I mean, there's another one. I mean, these are all these cliches. Let me see. But then also in all this discussion, what is strange and what is amazing is they keep talking about just causes, but they didn't talk about the use in battle. So I find this is noteworthy. And then perhaps let me skip this. I don't have time. Now, with that endorsement of the just war and also the just causes, and then also they have a statement early on that didn't go into detail, but they are saying that in any future wars, China is going to engage. Why don't we read that? I mean, that's amazing. Here it says, this is by military, very high-ranking military strategists, and saying that all wars that China might have to fight in the future will be forced upon her. These are examples, and such wars will be just and defensive wars and be fought with no other choice. And he's talking about all wars. All right. So there's, in that case, then in any future, any wars that erupt in China would perceive themselves fighting a just war. So in that case, the use in battle would be very important. Otherwise, there's no way. There would not be any common language, common moral language that we can talk about during the fight. But it seems, but then the PLA establishment has been silent on the use in battle. But only establishment. There are a few scholars that I'm trying to say later on that have that sensitivity. There's ambivalence. There are four reasons to explain this. The first one is the fact of culture. Now I have these two books with me, and I recommend any military institution in this country to buy and read these books. These two books are the only books available that will give you a glimpse into the military ethics of the PLA. It's published only a year ago. They are all expositions and comments on the different military ethics of different countries. And in this book, it covers not only the Western countries, not only USA, UK, Germany, and France, but also covers Israel, Japan, India, Islam, and so on and so forth. Time's up for me. Okay, I try to wrap up. Let me see. This is one bold, and in one of these books, no, actually in both, there's one page that they said, the just war language, they said that actually it exists in ancient Greece, in Rome, and so on and so forth, and it's just only in the particular content that we find differences. So they admit, we are familiar, we are on the same page when we talk about just war, but we have slightly different understanding what it is. And then this one is a very bold assertion. It says that the Western just war theory has differences with both traditional Chinese and Marxist just war theories, but they have the same moral vision of morally restraining the proliferation of warfare and of promoting peace. This is one of the most astonishing statements I detect in reading these two books, and this is very treasurable for them to say this. And so let me see. And then they say that, so we have some research on these youths in Bellow, and then they said, we know them very well. We know these youths in Bellow very well. However, they said that in spite of that, but this is not the only reasonable ethics, because ethics is conditioned by cultural values, and Chinese cultural values are different from and not inferior to Western ones. And so they would not, there's an unwillingness to adopt this as it is, and therefore there's some ambivalence about the just war language. And then let me skip this, and then skip this. And so that's the first factor to explain why they have been being ambivalent, because of the fact of culture. So if Western just war ethics is presented as an enlightenment project, discerned by neutral reason, by Westerners, and by having binding on all nations, it would not be accepted by the PLA. And then that's the first factor, the factor of culture. And the factor of internal debate, I'll skip this, you can read this, and then there's a factor of international politics. And the PLA now is talking about soft power, so they are very willing to learn from the West on just war ethics. And then the factor of divergence, I'll skip all these. Actually, what I'm trying to say is there's a divergence in these 7 military ethics. And then the first treatise, the Masterson's Art of War, actually has the least just war elements. And unfortunately, it is the most popular treatise among the 7 in China as well as in USA. And I try to skip all these. However, there's one scholar who is willing to come forward and acknowledge there's a certain limitation of the Sun Tzu's Art of War in spite of its popularity, namely that there's no discrimination between just causes and unjust causes. So this is a very bold criticism, but you don't see it in many other interpretations. So I'll skip all these and I'll skip all these. All right, let's go to looking ahead, the prospects. So in the future, there's bound to be different interpretations of the just war tradition in China, just like there's different interpretation of the just war, of the Western just war tradition as in this country. And then also, within China, there is a tug of war. The government will have a certain voice, and then the civil society will have another voice. I mean, the future development will depend on how such a tug of war will go. And then how about those, say, outside China? What can they do? There are many things that they could do that will encourage a more healthy development, like, do more research on these other 6 military classics rather than just on Sun Tzu, and try to refute the wrongness of Johnston and so on and so forth. And then try to have more dialogue and mutual visits. And whenever you visit, donate as many works on just war to them as possible. Actually, they have, in one of the books, they have a list of this. They say that we know there are some recent books on just war published in English, and they have a list of those. But it's a very small list. So if you donate more to them, they will know more. And they say they will try to translate more of them into Chinese. And then this is a multicultural world. And then, so I would say that if possible, if in the future, that someone can compile an anthology of just war ethics, a multicultural approach that consists of primary readings, not just interpretations. And in that case, there would be, and then it would be nice. And then China has done her part in trying to understand Western just war ethics, and I try to show you in these volumes. And so if China would feel respected if there are attempts of reverse understanding and appreciation. And such attempts will be reported back to China. And only on such a basis of equal respect can the PLA and the Chinese people be bold enough to assimilate into their warfare ethics more components of Western just war ethics, cross-cultural overlapping consensus on warfare ethics, rather than Western ethics. Thank you.
All right, as advertised, BC, thank you. Our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Valerie Morkevicius. She is a 2010-2011 resident fellow at the Stockdale Center here. For the past 2 years, she was a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at DePaul in Chicago, obviously. She previously had taught 2 years at St. Xavier University, also in Chicago. She completed her BA in French and East Asian languages and literatures at Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She then headed to the University of Chicago, much like Ed Barrett. She did an MA in the Committee on International Relations in 2000 and a PhD in political science in 2008. Her dissertation was entitled Unholy Alliance, the Just War Traditions as Power Politics, and it explores the realist underpinnings of Christian, Islamic, and Hindu just war thinking. And again, like Ed, she had Professor Elstein not just on her committee, but as the chair of her committee. Let me just read you a few of her recent publications, a breathtaking list. The Prism of Just War, Asian and Western Perspectives on the Legitimate Use of Military Force. A piece on the Protestant just war thought in World Religions and Norms of War. An essay, Just War, an Ethic of Restraint or the Defense of Order, was published in Justice and Violence, Political Violence, Pacifism, and Cultural Transformation. This year, she will publish a critique of the just war thought from the Protestant just peace perspective in a book edited by Greg Reichberg and Matt Levering, whom many of you know. She'll also have a source book chapter on the norms of war in Protestant Christianity, again in an edited volume published by Cambridge. It's forthcoming. And she's working on, as though she weren't already busy enough, turning her dissertation into a book, and she'll have a journal submission, Power and Order, the Shared Logics of Realism and Just War Theory. So, Valerie, we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, although I owe a huge amount of debt to Professor Elstein, I should relieve her of responsibility for my dissertation. She was on the committee, but my chair was Bob Pape. So,
I apologize. Thank you.
Hence the realist influence on my thought. That caveat aside, I have 3 more thanks and caveat points. So one is thank you to the class of 1962, who's sitting in the back row. They paid for my fellowship this year, so I had to thank them. And then a list of caveats. Unlike the canonical tradition apparently in China before 1911, and unlike in Islam and in Western Christianity, Hinduism is not a textual religion, and there's not a canon of just war theory. So entering into this sort of project is something you do with a lot of trepidation and nervousness, because you're making claims that expand over about 5,000 years of history and that end before the Mughal invasion, right? So you're looking at a period of time that ends before the modern era, and then from that you're trying to imagine what modern implications would be. So that's the dangerous waters into which I'm walking. So nonetheless, right, as an ancient religious tradition, Hinduism has a great deal to say about the ethics of war. Holy scriptures, poetry, advice to kings, and ancient legal codes can all provide insight into the Hindu idea of just war. But India's absorption into the Mughal Empire and later the British Empire meant that for centuries, Hindu insights into the ethics of war and conflict were subsumed by Islamic and Christian ones. Modern India emerged from the colonial era as a resolutely secular democracy, further restricting the possibility of an active Hindu discourse on the norms of war. Realistically, this means that as far as I know, there are 4 or 5 academics who are doing work on this in the United States and in India. And in terms of public discourse in India, there's almost nothing on the part of the major political parties for a variety of political reasons. These historical realities, in turn, shape my talk today. The first half focuses on the, actually more first 2/3, focus on the ethics of war as derived from Hinduism's ancient texts. This requires entering into not only a different religious and cultural world, but into a different historical milieu, where the capabilities and limitations of fighting forces were quite different than they are today. And in my text, I've sort of organized my talk today around categories of just war thought, ad bellum and in bello, although those don't actually exist in those terms in the tradition. And I've organized it in that way because I think it will be clearer to communicate the points to you that way. And so I'm eschewing a historical perspective, which would show that these ideas actually morph and change over time, among other possible ways I could have organized my points. The second half of my talk will attempt to suggest some ways in which the traditional understandings might be applicable in the modern world. So let's begin by talking about the textual tradition. The first caveat I've already mentioned, it's not a textual religion, so take it with a grain of salt, right? The texts exist, some people know them, religious scholars know them. The stories of the greatest treatises, the Mahabharata, for example, or the Ramayana, are both pop culture and sacred religious texts. So people might be quite familiar with the stories. But nonetheless, it's not the same sort of religion where an everyday believer would go to one of these texts to try to find an answer to a problem, right? Instead, it's a lived experience, which is rather different. Second, the texts cover a huge expanse of time, which is divided into roughly two halves. There's the Vedic age, which is from roughly 1500 to 500 BC, and the post-Vedic age. And if I was going to give it in a historical format, I would point out that the rules of war in these two contexts are quite different. The Vedic age is less restrictive in both cause and conduct, whereas the post-Vedic age is more restrictive. My dissertation can talk about why, but I won't here. Okay, so let's proceed in three parts to take a look at the ethics of war based on these texts. First, we'll explore the role of the use of force in the world, touching on themes of legitimate authority and just cause. Second, we'll delve into the in bello rules of war. And lastly, we'll consider some of the alternatives to war that exist within the tradition. So let's begin with the ad bellum perspective. In Hinduism, force is seen as a natural part of life, a tool used by the virtuous to protect the innocent, and not only as a tool used by the strong to oppress the weak. These dueling types of force used for order, force used for good, versus force used for chaos and force used for evil, can be witnessed throughout the natural world, and human societies are no exception. For example, the Code of Manu expresses the idea by saying, if the king did not tirelessly inflict punishment on those who would be punished, the stronger would roast the weaker like fish on a spit. The crow would eat the sacrificial cake. There would be no ownership in everyone, and everything would be upside down. The whole world is mastered by punishment. The idea here is that force is not actually something which is bad or dangerous or needs to be restricted. Force is merely something which has to be used in the right ways. And in used in the right ways, it prevents all sorts of bad things that we don't like chaos, disorder, and social unrest. Consequently, the use of force is not itself inherently either good or bad. It's simply something that is. Its normative value comes from the outcomes it produces, from its ends. This makes the Hindu approach quite different from pacifist perspectives, which see the use of force as inherently problematic, and from the Judeo-Christian and Islamic approaches to just war, which are much more interested in the motivations, intentions, and causes that drive the use of force than Hinduism is. This being said, when force is used to maintain order and uphold justice, and my timer won't stay awake, force is not only necessary, but a positive good. If rulers did not use force to restrain and punish wrongdoers, evil would triumph and the innocent would suffer. One famous passage from the Mahabharata is the chapter, which is the Bhagavad Gita. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, he's a prince, and he's about to fight a war, which happens to be a civil war against his cousins, who have treated him and his brothers terribly badly, have stolen the throne, and really they've reached last resort. And if you've been reading along in the whole Mahabharata up till this point, you can't understand why on earth Arjuna hasn't already gotten it done with and fought this battle, because the other side is really evil, and they've had it out for him for a long time. But Arjuna, on the eve of the battle, is overlooking the battlefield, and he sees all of his friends and family on the other side. His teachers are aligned on the other side, and they're all out there ready to die, fighting against him and his brothers. And he panics, and he's not ready to fight. And his chariot driver turns out not to be just an ordinary chariot driver, but is actually God, and which is awesome, right? So Lord Krishna turns to him and says, let me explain to you why you need to go. And Arjuna argues against him, not realizing that it's God. And ultimately, Krishna has to reveal himself to Arjuna, who's doubtful up until that point, and says, these worlds would collapse if I did not perform action. I would create disorder in society. Living beings would be destroyed. Therefore, following in his footsteps, wise men should act with detachment to preserve the world. And he pushes Arjuna out the door to fight against his relatives. So the point of that entire passage, which is the culmination of the Mahabharata, is that it's absolutely necessary to fight, and it's also a duty to fight when you are fighting for the right reasons for a just cause. Failure to fight would be failure not only to do as Krishna asked you to do, but failure to ensure order and peace and good at the expense of creating chaos, disorder, and evil. This separates also the Hindu ethical perspective from the Western just war tradition. Arguably, a just cause, even when all the other ad bellum principles are met, create a permissive right within traditional just war thought. One may fight under these circumstances in the West, but one is not necessarily obligated to do so. By contrast, for the kingly caste, for the kshatriya, like Arjuna, using force is an obligation when it is necessary. So even though he has to do something that's very distasteful to him in fighting against friends and family, it's not a choice. He has no choice in the matter. Although the Hindu tradition restricts the use of just force to the kshatriya caste, there is not a specific set of ideas limiting such usage to a particular individual or set of individuals, as there is in the Western principle or Islamic principle of legitimate authority. So although the text will talk about a king having a right to use force or a prince having a right to use force, it's actually referring to an entire caste of individuals, which makes it rather different. Furthermore, the Hindu tradition does not distinguish between private and public uses of force, nor between domestic and international ones. They're all considered on par on the same sort of level. The focus, in terms of thinking about just cause, is on the things that prompt people to fight rather than the legitimate causes for fighting. And so, for example, there's a tendency in the text to list possible provocations that lead to war or types of war rather than to rank them by legitimacy. In Kautilya's Arthasastra, which is a sort of political science text, Indra divides just war into 4 classes: wars caused by invasion of one's territory, wars caused by something done to others prejudicial to your powers, wars resulting from some dispute about boundaries, and wars caused by some disturbance of the mandala. I'll talk about that mandala in a moment. Each type of war relates in some way to restoration or preservation of order, whether domestic, international, or cosmic. So if you were to try to boil this down to a single type of just cause, just cause is fighting to preserve order. Although Hinduism doesn't specifically list causes in the usual way, it does have an ancient tradition of what we might call today international relations analysis, where the world is conceived along the lines of a mandala system. At the center is a powerful king surrounded by other kings, spreading outward in concentric rings. A wise king knows his position in the system. He knows how close he is to the center. He knows whether his neighbors are stronger or weaker, and tries to make the best of his position. When he is strong, he defeats peer competitors to prevent future problems. So our conversation about preventative war yesterday, it's not a problem if you happen to be the wise king. When weak, he seeks alliances with the more powerful and avoids trouble, tries to avoid getting into conflict with his neighbors. This worldview would be seen as encouraging a sort of imperial spread, and the stronger the king in the center, the more stable the system. The argument is actually made that if you had a very powerful king in the center who could subsume all the kings underneath him, you would have the situation for world peace, aka the world under a single government. This being said, while imperialism strikes us as disturbing, in this case, we should think of it as something that could actually be creating peace and order. First of all, it's presumed that only a good and a wise king would have the power to expand. The qualities of good kingship are tied to moral virtues. Without the moral virtues, a king cannot succeed. So the only person who could succeed in acquiring all of this power in the mandala system would be someone who deserved to succeed. Second, it's assumed that the king intends to further the good of the state by seeking its expansion. This follows naturally from the first presumption, since a virtuous king would not seek personal aggrandizement. The argument is that acquiring new territory adds wealth and power to the king's home state, which, because of course he's a good king, he will use to take care of the people's needs and to defend them against internal and external enemies. Furthermore, the acquisition of new territory brings more people under the benign rule of the good king, keeping in mind that the conqueror's king is a virtuous one, and his goal is the good of his people. He's expected to be magnanimous in conquest. And here we have a little bit to say with jus post bellum. The people of the annexed territory are to be treated as equals with his original citizenry, so they become citizens on par with those who he was already responsible for. Their interests and defense are now the king's obligation. Thus, he cannot sap the territory dry, transferring its resources to his distant imperial capital. In addition, the conquering king is expected to keep the traditional religious and legal structures of the conquered territories in place, and in some cases, this may even mean rehabilitating the former leadership. Presuming the former king or prince was not evil, but merely weak, the conqueror should put him, or if necessary, a close family member of the king, back in charge after having conquered the territory. So if you can sort of imagine what this would have looked like in Iraq, we would have taken Saddam out of power temporarily, chided him, instructed him in his duties if he didn't understand them. We would have replaced him with one of his sons, who would then be the local regional governor in Iraq under sort of US tutorial charge. Prisoners of war and slaves taken during the course of the war are to be freed upon the ending of war. A few other just causes can be pulled out besides this idea of imperial expansion. One is the idea of righting wrongs. The Mahabharata, the story I just told you a little bit about, is a key case in point, as is the Ramayana. The bad guys are criminal. They're not just unvirtuous, right? They commit various offenses. And in order to stop this lawlessness, one must fight against them. Kings are also obligated to rescue the oppressed, which is an idea that comes out particularly in the Mahabharata as well. And perhaps the whole story of the Ramayana, where Rama is rescuing his kidnapped wife, is a similar sort of story. Tyrannicide and regime change may be legitimate, although you can't do it yourself, right? So the people themselves are not permitted to do it, but another king can intervene on another king's behalf. So one example of this is a story from the Mahabharata where a young Brahmin, a young priest, curses his king for making the father of the Brahmin carry a corpse, which is an unclean act. And his father says to him, "I don't approve of his crime, yet our like must always condone the ruling king. The law that is hurt hurts back. Were the king not to protect us, we would be severely oppressed. We would not be able to live the law as we desire." So the people themselves can't rise up against the kingly caste, but another member of the kingly caste is purely welcome to do so. And in this case, you'll be happy to know a good king does intervene. I should note that there's no mention of religion or ideology as a just cause across any of these texts. The principle of last resort does exist. In the Mahabharata, the good guys wait more than 13 years. In the Ramayana, Rama waits something like 7 years before fighting back to get what was arguably theirs in the first place. In addition, the Arthasastra, which is one of these political texts, says that even when the advantages of peace and war are equal, one should prefer peace, for war causes loss of power and wealth and is troublesome and sinful. There's lots of warnings throughout the tradition that war's results are unpredictable. The Code of Manu points out it can be observed that neither victory nor defeat belongs permanently to either of the two powers who fight in battle. Therefore, one should avoid fighting. Because if you can settle it through diplomacy, you might actually get what you want, whereas once you go into battle, there's no guarantee that the good side will win. So there's lots of suggestions in the various texts to pursue diplomacy first, to pursue what we might consider today covert actions first, and to end with open battle only as a last resort. Finally, there is a point about what makes a war unjust, which is made quite clearly in most of the texts, but I have only 4 minutes. So to summarize it, I will say, "Thou shalt not take what is not yours, and thou shalt not act out of greed or personal self-aggrandizement." Okay. So now that we've figured out what you can fight for and about, we should talk about how one should fight. And the key words here are honor and fairness. The Hindu tradition includes principles for fighting a war according to dharma, which can be understood broadly as legal principles. This type of dharma yuddha, or legal war, is in contrast with adharma yuddha, which are wars which are not fought according to the rules. In the latter, various dishonorable stratagems, sneak attacks, deceptive ruses, assassins, and poisons can be used, as well as non-standard military forces. While the two categories of war are not considered morally equivalent, the choice of which to use is left up to the king as a matter of rational political choice. A weak king may make use of dishonorable stratagems if necessary. A strong king ought to fight an open war using the higher standard. The break preventing abuse of this choice is that kings are frequently reminded in the literature to be careful realists. They should not overestimate their means, and they should carefully examine their personal motivations, for excitement and power are not synonymous, right? So the idea that you might be very excited about fighting a war and the idea that you might actually have some capacity to win it are not the same thing. Kings are also, is that me? No, that's not me, that's you. Sorry. Kings are also, we both have iPhones, so we're sort of desperately shutting off the timer. I got a new 20 minutes. I think we were down to 4, however. Okay. So, kings are also encouraged to avoid violating conventions, for evil will be repaid with evil. In thinking about the in bello rules expressed within Dharma Yuddha, the Hindu tradition begins at a point parallel to Augustine. One must fight virtuously for a virtuous end. To some extent, good behavior flows naturally from the fact that presumably a good king will tend to exhibit good qualities in his behavior. There are two broad sets of rules regarding violence in war. First, non-combatants and their property must be spared. Some individuals belong to the category of non-combatants because of who they are. Peasants, beggars, women, children, and Brahmin, the priestly caste, are all to be immune from attack because of their membership in these groups. For example, the Sauptika asserts that one should not cast weapons upon one's kin, that's Arjuna's problem, upon Brahmins, kings, again his problem, women, friends, one's own mother, one's own preceptor, a weak woman, an idiot, a blind man, a sleeping man, a terrified man, one just risen from sleep, an intoxicated person, and one that is heedless. Ambassadors and envoys are also considered immune. The duty of hospitality renders guests and those seeking asylum or refuge also illegitimate targets. Now, obviously, the second half of that list seemed to be quite different from the first half. The first half are people who are immune because of who they are. The second half are immune because of what they are doing at the moment, right? They're being intoxicated or they're running away. These non-combatants, who are non-combatants because of their specific behaviors, are individuals, even soldiers, who do not pose threats for one reason or another. So the common theme across all of them is that they can't pose a threat. They're injured or otherwise disabled. They're struck with incapacitating fear, temporarily blinded, or have broken weapons, which poses some really interesting ideas. For example, the Code of Manu has another similarly lengthy list. Anyone who has climbed on a mound, or an impotent man, a man who folds his hands in supplication, who's begging not to be killed, someone whose hair is unbound. So if you are sort of in a panic and your hair has fallen out of your braid, sometimes translated your hair is disheveled, which I think always gets me off the hook. Anyone who is seated or who says, I am yours, anyone asleep, without armor, naked, without a weapon, not fighting, not watching, or engaged with someone else. So imagining hand-to-hand battle, if PC and I are fighting, then it's not right for Brian to attack me from behind. Anyone whose weapons have been broken, anyone who's in pain, badly wounded, terrified, or fleeing, right? So this is clearly a much broader concept of immunity. And so the idea here is that one's not necessarily immune because of only who you are, but also what you are capable of doing. So non-threats are illegitimate targets. Property is to be respected, including gardens and farms, along with religious places. Turning to the second category of rules, away from who shouldn't be attacked, we should talk about how you should fight against those who can be attacked. Combatants should fight in ways that are honorable and fair. This principle is actually comprised of several related chivalric rules. Not only should war be openly declared, but battles should be declared as well, their time and place agreed upon in advance. Battles should not be fought at night, nor in such a way that one side will have the sun in their eyes continuously through the entire battle, because that would give one side an advantage. For example, one should also fight with matched weapons, with weapons that are equal in kind. So if you are fighting with a chariot, the other side should have chariots, and vice versa. One example of what will happen to you if you don't comes from the Ramayana. Rama is in a chariot battle with another enemy, and Rama is the favorite of most of the gods. And his chariot breaks down. He jumps off the chariot and continues fighting on foot. His enemy remains mounted in the chariot, which is obviously a huge advantage. And Rama keeps fighting and fighting, and he's not winning, but he's also not losing. The gods ultimately interrupt on the grounds that it is unfair for the battle to continue because his partner has not stepped down. In addition to fighting using equally matched weapons, soldiers should not make use of horrific weapons. These include those which are concealed, barbed, or smeared with poison, or whose points blaze with fire. All of these are considered inhumane. Finally, soldiers should fight with detachment. They should fight because it is their duty, because it is necessary, and not out of anger or hatred for the enemy. So in the remaining 12 seconds, the alternatives to violence. Most of you have probably heard of Gandhi, and so you're wondering where all of this fits in with what Gandhi was talking about. So Gandhi was drawing on the alternative tradition within Hinduism, which is ahimsa, or a non-violent form of conflict. And this idea exists in tension with all of these ideas for fighting. And if we think about the way in which force and non-force, violence and non-violence balance in Hinduism, the wise king should choose when to use non-violent tactics and when to use violent ones. So in a way, Gandhi was not necessarily making a permanently pacifist argument if we sort of contextualize it within a broader Hindu tradition. He was making a specific argument for a time and place that says this is the time and place for ahimsa or non-violence, but presumably in another case, had India been a more powerful state, for example, then it might have chosen to use a different way to gain its independence. So lastly, in the overtime, please, modern strategic relevance. First of all, the recognition that resources are scarce and scarcity leads to conflict, that war is inevitable in the world system, might be something which is useful for us to keep in mind. With all of our various projects to try to reduce the amount of war that happens, or perhaps to write it out of our vocabulary entirely, unless we do something about the scarcity problem, not to sound too much like a realist for a moment, we might not be able to do anything about the war problem. In addition, the Hindu tradition stresses that negotiations and other forms of trying to press your claim are necessary prior to actual waging of war, and a closer investigation of their ideas about how negotiations could work out and ways in which you could use ahimsa or nonviolence could also be useful ways of expressing or expanding our own conversation. And I had originally planned to tell you more about those, but I'm not going to, except to mention that in addition to alliance, you could give gifts, you could ferment internal discord and let it work out on its own, and other sort of creative ways of solving regime change problems without direct intervention. Lastly, and perhaps most intriguingly, is this idea that friendship may only be possible among equals. And that warfare should be fought not asymmetrically, but symmetrically. What would that mean in the modern context? What would be the modern version of the gods telling Rama's opponent to step down from his chariot when we think about this from the point of view of a very powerful, wealthy, and militarily well-endowed state? Among other things, this suggests that there might be reason to take the idea of disarmament more seriously, or perhaps selective disarmament, so not fighting all of our wars using equal amounts of technology. And exactly where that would take us in terms of coin operations, I'm not sure on a practical level, but it certainly suggests some imaginative new approaches that wouldn't have been found within one of the other traditions. Thank you.
Okay, that was around the world in 60 minutes plus. And let's go around the room in maybe 10. James?
I have two things I want to pose to all of you, actually. But I would just make a personal comment about where you ended up, Valerie. That is, I'm not sure that would be the way to go, because the much modern technology actually has, or can have, the effect, depending on how it's used, of limiting the lethality of war. And so there might be a contrary argument that technology ought to be shared so as to make it possible for, give drones to the other side before you start fighting. I don't know. I don't want to.
That's a good idea, actually.
I just wanted to observe that. The two issues I wanted to propose are first to ask you if you're willing to talk at all when you look towards the present and the future, towards the relationships between the cultures that come out of these traditions and the law of armed conflict. This is something that I frequently talk about in regard to the relation of just war tradition and the law of armed conflict, both in terms of its history and also in terms of how a critical view of the law of armed conflict. And I just wonder if you three would be willing to address that for your traditions and the cultures that are associated with them. And then the other thing to all of you, and again, it came out of something you were saying towards the end there, Valerie, that is, who's going to be fighting? Who are these traditions about? And I know that the answer is different for Islamic tradition. I'm not entirely sure where it is, and maybe it's variable for Chinese tradition, but it does sound like in the Hindu tradition, it's aimed at the kshatriya, the warrior caste. And in the West, that's true to an extent, in that the chivalric code plays an independent part in the historical development of the just war tradition, kicking in effect, essentially in the 100 Years' War period. But there, if you think about the issues we were talking about yesterday, which included issues having to do with the moral equality of soldiers and proportionality and so on, the chivalric approach was very had some very negative implications for the non-knights because they, not being knights, really from the knights' point of view, weren't supposed to be out there anyway, and so they were vermin, and they could be killed without compunction. Whereas typically you wouldn't necessarily want to kill a knight, his brother in arms. You'd want to defeat him, you'd want to capture him, and so forth. And so you end up with a rather different conception of the issue of the moral equality of soldiers if you come at it from that perspective. But I'd be interested in how the three of you see the implications of these traditions for who's going to be fighting. Who are the traditions addressed to?
Me first?
Well, if you want.
I was going to go first.
Oh,
Will it be Alphonse or Gaston?
It'll be Alphonse.
On your first question, Jim, about the law of armed conflict, did you have a particular issue in mind?
There are many ways it can come out. I mean, if you pick up the Robertson Wealth collection and go through it and look at the various elements of the contemporary law of armed conflict, and particularly read the part that I think sometimes is most interesting, the part at the end of each section where you see who has agreed to these and who hadn't, and what the reservations are of a lot of the countries that have agreed to it. That can be just enormously interesting. In 2003, when Operation Iraqi Freedom was getting going, there were instances where the Iraqi Fedayeen engaged usually transport columns by coming in and pretending to be just ordinary Bedouin until they got there, and then throwing their robes open and pulling out their rocket launchers or their AK-47s and opening fires. And this, according to the Geneva Protocol 1 interpretation of the Lieber rules, could be allowable. But neither Iraq nor the U.S. had signed protocol, or had agreed to Protocol 1. So it's not clear how much that was bearing on either of them. But the broader point, I mean, I don't really want to get into these individual things. What I'm really trying to get is is how the people who are using these traditions in the present day think about what they're doing with respect to the international law of armed conflict.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we're talking about the people that I was talking about today, I would think not a great deal. They're not thinking about that. Now, if we're talking about at the level of states that have been participants at the UN and in other international organizations, Muslim states are signatories of a number of the major conventions, as you know. And at that level, I mean, there's, I think, a strong interest in participating in some kind of international order, which would include notions of the law of armed conflict. But one of the things we're on now, as you know, is we have groups that are challenging that entire set of political arrangements, including the legitimacy of the states that have participated and signed on to these things. So depends on.
More generally, the argument by radical Islamists that you find sometimes that international law is Islamic.
Oh, well, now that's another angle, the kind of apologetic thing you mean. In other words, the argument that historically speaking, contemporary international law was copied from Muslim sources. But I would think that the main people arguing that have been of a different, have had different interests than Al-Qaeda and so on. As far as who the traditions are aimed at, I mean, classically speaking, the tradition was developed. Some people argue it was entirely a jurist's law, you know, that they were dreaming up cases and answering these questions. But we have records of encounters between the scholars and caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and so on, who actually address questions to them and ask for responses. So I would say that classically speaking, the tradition was aiming at people who made decisions, either at the level of the caliph or the caliph's designee, the provincial governors, or the commanders of forces, because there's a lot governing the behavior of units in the field, particularly with respect to the distribution of war prizes and so on.
But there is no specific class of knights or soldiers.
Well, there are certainly state armies who are supposed to be disciplined by these things. At least I've argued that some of the early texts correspond with a change from the time when you kind of had people just being called to jihad to go out to standing armies that are under the control of the central authority, and that the development of these norms, these judgments, has to do or correlates with that. So there is that sense of regularization, but the rulings are aimed at the people in responsibility who are supposed to keep control of the units in the classical period anyway.
Any thoughts from our other panelists, PC, Valerie?
I'm not that familiar with that international law of armed conflict, but from what I know, I mean, China signed many laws, many treaties, but signing them is one thing. I mean, abiding by it would be another thing. So law is static, but ethics is dynamic. So for me, I think the crucial issue is still whether the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA are willing to embrace just war ethics wholeheartedly. And that's the second part of my presentation was on this topic. If they are willing to embrace just war ethics wholeheartedly, then naturally they will be in that direction of trying to abide by these international law.
I think in response to your first question, India is a signatory to most of these international agreements as well. And there are two further points, right? One is, in the 1960s, there was in India a pretty large discourse among international lawyers in India about the relationship between international law and sort of traditional Indian laws and customs. And it was partly to sort of make the point that these are not colonial laws that India is signing on to, that these are laws that reflect broad humanitarian principles that we can all sign on to. So there's a tradition there of trying to bring traditional, classical, ancient Hindu ideas into line with the laws of war, and they're not seen as being in tension by that group of scholars. Secondly, in a way, if you think about the structure of the mandala system in the classical argument, there's an idea that this is a little bit like the international order and a concern with some sort of international order. And you could imaginatively make the king in the middle of the United Nations or something like that. And there's certainly been, among Indian scholars who do work on international law, a lot of interest in working through the United Nations and sort of building up international communities and organizations. On your second question about who this is addressed to, you're right, these texts, well, the legal texts and the princely mirrors sort of texts are obviously aimed at the Kshatriya caste. And the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and those sorts of scriptural texts are aimed at everyone, right? So I think that texts like the Mahabharata are in a way justifying the whole of Hindu ethics, justifying the caste system and so on to the whole population. And insofar as they have rules about fighting, they're also telling everyday people what should be acceptable, what you should see, right, if a good king is fighting in a good way. Modern India, obviously, by law, no longer has a caste system, right? So in practice, that's not exactly true, but legally speaking, there's no caste system. So if one tried to imagine who it would now be speaking to if you picked up the text, the Kshatriya can't be thought of as existing as a caste from the point of view of the government. But the Kshatriya could represent everyone in the armed forces. So there's a way in which it could be fairly easily moved into being a modern text by just shifting from calling them the Kshatriya or kingly caste to calling them members of the armed forces. I don't think that it's logically problematic, right? But obviously that's not who the text was aiming at.
Could I just make one comment about when I asked that question about international law? It's the clash of civilizations question. James Brown Scott back in the 40s who was the first one that really did a serious study of ethics of war and rules of war in different cultures, argued that where you have the boundaries is where you find this group and this group, the different traditions, is where you find the wars that are hardest to restrain. And so I was really probing at whether the common allegiance to the international laws of armed conflict exist from the perspectives of these three cultures, and thus undercut the idea that the clash of civilizations.
Could we just lump that in, sir, with Professor Tesson? He's been waiting patiently, and perhaps there'll be additional comments to that point.
That wasn't a question.
Okay.
I just have a brief question for John. John, the second group that you mentioned that criticizes Al-Qaeda's methods. This is a group that nevertheless agrees with Al-Qaeda with the goal of establishing divine governance, right? My question is this group, whoever they are, I'm not sure who they are, but whoever they are, this group that argues this, does it argue that divine governance should be established by an ethical war, that is a war that abides, that does not resort to terrorist methods, or does it argue that divine governance should be established by persuasion?
Okay. Well, it's not a single group. Now, I was grouping together a certain kind of criticism that's articulated by a number of people. And the ones I was thinking of do seem largely to believe that it will not be possible in the current circumstance to achieve the goal of establishing a legitimate Islamic state without resort to force. They do seem to believe that. Now, if we weren't so focused, if I wasn't focusing here on military ethics and notions of war, I would have talked about some groups of people who share the goal of governance by divine law in some broad sense, but who insist that military means are inappropriate. There are such people. So there is a broader category here. It's worth saying, too, when you give a short talk and you're trying to identify these types of criticisms, this second grouping of people, I would say, agree on the notion of governance by divine law. But since texts are notoriously malleable, all the particulars of divine law can be matters of debate. So you could have someone who insisted on this as a goal, but who argued that in some sense the texts pertaining to, say, inheritance laws for women that are outlined in Quran chapter 3 aren't to be understood as something that can kind of be plopped onto a 21st century society. So you can have some dissent and argument even within the agreement on that overarching notion of governance by divine law. Yeah.
Our hosts have graciously allowed us another 5 minutes because we kicked off a little bit late. So we had a question behind the pillar, and then we're going to come over to Bill.
Hey, thank you. Actually, I'd love to hear from all the panelists on this, but in the interest of time, I'd like to direct this to the Chinese case. So acknowledging that there's a gap between Western just war theory and scholarship and how the West actually prosecutes its wars. I was wondering about the relationship between Chinese just war canon and the extent to which that canon actually informs and constrains when and how the Chinese look at war and how they fight and prepare for war today.
In the past, I mean, that set of canons do have that, I mean, binding force on how wars is supposed to be fought. But as in the second half of my presentation, I'm saying that right now we're living in a post-canon age. So the authority of the canon has diminished, and also it's a fragmented canon right now. So right now, as it is, I mean, these treatises do not by themselves have any binding force. It's entirely the kind of pick and choose attitude. You think this is valuable, then you abide by it. Otherwise, you can just ignore it. So this is the situation right now. So there's no direct any kind of instructive force from the canon to the actual behavior of the PLA today, right now. But my hope is that the PLA establishment would eventually would retrieve and also would inherit the full just war ethics that are present in these seven treatises, and would treasure them in such a way that they would become their own ethics, and then to have self-restraint that way by appealing to their own just war ethics rather than to the just war ethics of America, for example.
Bill, I think you'll have the last question.
This is sort of an extension of Jim's question. I think PC already answered it, so it'll be addressed to, respectively, to John and Valerie. John, can you say anything about the influence of Islamic thought on contemporary thinking of the professional military, either in Islamic countries or in secular countries like Turkey with a Muslim majority, and Valerie, likewise, can you say anything at all about the influence of Hindu thought on contemporary professional military thought in India?
Interesting question. The things I'm familiar with, say a pamphlet studied by the Egyptian military and to which they are accountable. This is from the 1970s. Quotes a few Quranic verses and hadith reports here and there, but by and large is salted with things that would probably be recognized in terms of the law of armed conflict. That would be a source of criticism on the part of the people I was focusing on today, who, after all, are not a professional military force by definition. I mean, in some ways, they've made a career out of fighting, but they're not a professional military force. I do also know that it's kind of a hobby in parts among military officers in parts of the Muslim world to study the battle tactics of the Prophet and that sort of thing, but that's another kind of stuff, yeah.
Well, sort of two answers. One is that in terms of political discourse or public discourse, Hindu ethics are off the table in India, right? So it's a non-starter to use the Hindu tradition in an official capacity to explain why one should fight in a certain way. So it would be difficult to sort of imagine any sort of official context in which that could be seen. That being said, there are sort of a cottage industry of publishing in India, of small monograms that are often by ex-military officers about the same sorts of things John was mentioning, about sort of wise ideas you could get from reading these advice to princes. And a similar thing exists for sort of wise business ideas that come from those. But I don't know how big their circulation is, right? It seems that they come from small presses, so it's maybe someone's personal hobby to do some reading and write them up. In terms of political discourse that is not happening within the official establishment, Hindu ethics are brought to bear on the discussion sometimes of nuclear weapons and proliferation in newspapers, in two opposing directions, which is really intriguing. So one direction sort of suggests that India is a great power. The other great powers are nuclearly armed. Therefore, we should continue in this direction, and there should be, sort of no opposition to it. The other side suggests, well, we're concerned about the possible effects of nuclear weapons, and since we couldn't actually use nuclear weapons against states that don't have them, then we should push for disarmament. And think of sort of other ways of dealing with our grand strategy. So it exists in sort of this discourse on the newspaper, journalistic, editorial level, but not on a governmental level.
All right, I'd like to thank the panelists and all of you for your insights and stamina.